So we did that. Well, we had a few hours to wait until 4 o'clock. So I suggested we go to a museum and take a look. The Rockefeller Museum is, to be specific, and when we got to the museum, it was locked. And the guard at the door told us, well, it's always closed on Tuesdays, and this happened to be a Tuesday. If you come back tomorrow, you can get in for free, but on Tuesdays it's closed. So here we were, standing in the middle of Jerusalem, just outside the old city, in front of the Rockefeller Museum with nothing to do, and I suggested to Lori, why don't we take a walk through the old city? We're right by Herod's Gate. We can go in Herod's Gate, walk across the city to the Jaffa Gate, and because Lori hasn't been with me on all of my trips, and I've stayed a lot when she's not with me at Christ Church, I could show her Christ Church. So we decided to do that. We got to Christ Church and looked around a little bit and went into the bookstore next door. And in talking with the manager of the bookstore, who again, he knew me when we walked in the door. The door hadn't even closed, and I heard a voice from the mezzanine saying, "Ah, the temple man." And he came down and talked with us. We'd been there earlier to see if he was there, and that's why he knew I was coming back. But the gal we talked to earlier in the day had told me that she knows nobody in Israel who knows more about the temple than Benjamin, the manager of that store. So when we sat down to talk, he said, "John, just about everything I know about the temple I learned from your book." So, for whatever that's worth. But the one thing he did say to us was, "I wish I had a copy of your model in this store, because almost weekly I have Orthodox Jewish people come in here who want to talk about Jesus. And I'd like to use the model as a means of talking with them about Jesus, their Messiah." And he told us just the week before we arrived that a man from the Lubavitch Jews, I don't know if you know them, the Hasidim are part of them. They're the ones you see in pictures with the black hats, curly, always wearing suits. But he had come into the bookstore, and when Benjamin asked him, "Would it offend you if I talked about Jesus Christ?" this guy said, "No, that's precisely why I came here." He said, "I would like to have a copy of the model so that we could talk about that with such people." So I right away started asking him, "Well, what size of a model will you want?" He says, "Well, this isn't a very big bookstore and we don't have much room." And we started talking, and what we came up with was a size like this little model over here. So when we got back to Portland, I set out to start to see what we could do with that. The problem I had is it's so little, so many fine little parts to it, that I didn't know how I was going to start making really detailed models of each one of these buildings and get them all exact at the size they were going to be just by doing them by hand. That was going to take, I mean, even a pencil mark, if my pencil is dull, it's going to be about a foot wide. And I can be off quite a bit by doing those kind of markings. And shortly after we got back from our trip, we were asked to come speak in a church down in Brownsville, Oregon. That happens to be where Richard Sneed attends. That's why he had to leave already, because he has a long trip home. But it was at that meeting that Richard Sneed came up to me and said, "Would you have any reason to use somebody who used machining in model making. And all of a sudden I thought, you know, that would be a perfect way. If you could get a machine to make these, because machines can work down to just thousandths of inches. He said, I work for a company that builds models for Hewlett-Packard. He said, I would be willing to use my spare time and be able to, or my boss has given me permission from time to time to use machines to make things for people, and I think we can be able to do this. But what I need is three-dimensional digital drawings. I had no idea what that was. But what he told me was I would need to start with a regular architectural drawing and then build that into a three-dimensional digital image. Well, I came home from that thinking, what am I going to do about that? I don't know an architect per se. I'd rather not just pick one out of the phone book. I'd like it if whoever was involved in this was somebody who knew the Lord and had a vested interest in what was going on. Well, there's one other person in this room who I haven't mentioned yet but needs to be mentioned right now. He's sitting in the front row right on the end. He was my roommate when I was here at seminary, Jerry Heacock. Jerry is a chaplain with Retired Ministries, and I appreciate you, Jerry. But at the time, Jerry and I were attending the same church, and our church happened to have a potluck after the morning service one time, and Lori and I were sitting there getting ready to eat, and Jerry came along and said, "Can I sit beside you?" And so I said, "Sure." So he sat down, and then another fella came and sat on the other side of him, and I heard Jerry start talking to this guy and asked him what he did. He said, "Oh, I'm a forensic architect." And I said, "Did I hear you say you were an architect?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "I need to talk with you." His name was David York. David York graciously allowed his staff to work with us to produce the drawings, and those drawings are in the book. But from that, we proceeded then, once we got the drawings done, now we needed to find someone who could put it in a three-dimensional, a 3D digital format. And I became acquainted with Matt Stormont. Matt Stormont and I worked for a long time together, went down to talk to Richard Sneed a couple of times, and somehow the programs that Matt had didn't match with what the computer would do, and it gave out too many lines that didn't belong, and it was really hard to clean them up and make them work. And we finally had to let that go because it just wasn't working. At that time, I heard about another gentleman. Bob Bedent is his name. When I called Bob Bedent, I didn't know him. I'd just gotten his name from my nephew who had used him because he needed some three-dimensional drawings done for a project he was doing at Portland Community College, because they're the ones with the three-dimensional programs that you see running outside. And I called Bob Bedent and set up an appointment to go talk with him about taking our drawings and turning them into three-dimensional, 3D digital drawings. And when I sat down across from him at his desk in his office, he said to me, "John, you're an answer to prayer for me." And I'm going, I didn't even know he was a believer, and here he is telling me I'm an answer to prayer. He said, work has been very slow here recently, and I was just praying that God would send some work our way. And then you called.